This is the Comics Alternative, episode 261. Reviews of Generation Gone, Volume 1, Assassinistas, Number 1, and Love and Rockets, Volume 4, Number 4. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Gwen, and we're two people with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And this week, Gwen and I are going to be discussing three recent releases. We're going to begin with Generation Gone, Volume 1, The Trade, by Aleš and André Lima, Araújo. And after that, we're going to look at issue number 1 of Assassinistas, written by Tini with art by Gilbert Hernandez. And on the topic of Gilbert Hernandez, we're going to continue on in that mode by looking at Love and Rockets, Volume 4, Number 4, by Gilbert and Jaime Hernandez. But before we get to that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by their great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right, Derek. For instance, right now at dcbservice.com, you can get Generation Gone Volume 1 for just $10.79, which is 40% off the cover price. You can get just about everything in the Love and Rockets canon for 35% off. And you can get Assassinistas number 4 for $2.59, which again is 35% off the cover price. So there's a lot of really great comics out there for us to get a hold of at Discount Comic Book Service.
That's right. You know, you really can't beat the prices of Discount Comic Book Service. I use them. Gwen, I know you may use them, and our listeners should as well. Go to dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Gwen and Derek sent you. Well, Gwen, last week you and I looked at the January previews catalog. Now we're looking at three recent titles. So I guess we're settling into the month of January and 2018.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's a little warmer here today. It was 30 whole degrees out when I went outside this morning, which is shocking. I mean, I tell you, shocking. It's amazing. It's really depressing when that feels super warm. Like, you know, it's below freezing still, but it feels warm. So, but I've had a lot of chance over the weekend. I'm working on my book, and I've had a lot of chance to read some great comics and to read these comics as well. So it's nice, even though the weather's not very nice outside, it makes for good comics reading indoors.
You know, it does. I had been out of town for the past week. I was seeing my family that's, you know, still in Frisco, Texas. And then just yesterday, as we record this, which was Sunday, the 7th, I got back to Charlotte, and I got here right at about the time that the cold snap is starting to lift. I heard that while I was away, we had temperatures here in Charlotte, North Carolina, that were in the teens. And wow. I did not anticipate that, so I didn't ready the house, in particular the pipes, for this. No. And luckily there was no problem, nothing frozen or broken or anything like that. So I was lucky, but I just didn't anticipate it getting that cold in Charlotte.
And also, you're right. I mean, the houses aren't set up for it. My parents used to live in Florida, and, you know, you'd kind of laugh at people's reaction. Oh my gosh, it's 40 degrees. But really, in a house like the one my parents had that wasn't particularly well insulated, 40 degrees is really darn cold. So right. I feel for our friends in the South who've been going through that.
Exactly. Yeah. But I agree with you that the one thing about the cold weather that I guess could be something like a silver lining is that it kind of forces you in many ways to stay inside in order to stay warm. And what better way to read great books or great comics than just sitting inside and with a blanket on you and catching up.
Absolutely.
Well, these titles that we're looking at this week are ones that you and I have been reading in the midst of this cold snap. And we're going to begin with Generation Gone, Volume 1. This is written by Aleš with art by André, Lima, Araújo. It comes out from Image Comics, and I think it was released last week on January 3rd. Now, Generation Gone was a 5-issue series. I think it's still going on. This is just the first volume, but the original 5 issues that make up this first trade was released between July and November of last year. And, Gwen, I do like Aleš work, and I try to keep up with him as best I can. I had been intending to read the individual issues of Generation Gone. Time got away from me. Other readings came up and other life issues came up. So this is my first exposure to Generation Gone, reading this trade. Now, had you looked at any of those 5 issues before the trade came out?
I'd looked at one of them in the comic store, and it looked really interesting, and so I was excited to have the opportunity to read the whole thing collected, making me feel really crappy because our generation is the one that's so villainous in this text. But on the other hand, I would actually consider teaching this in my young adult lit class because it really does deal with generational conflict in such an obvious way.
Yeah, I agree. That's one of the things that stood out to me in reading Generation Gone Volume 1 is that there's more of an emphasis on generational differences than I had expected. And I guess I should have expected it because the word generation is in the title. But yeah, the baby boomers, and I guess you and I are at the tail end of the baby boomers.
Yeah, in fact, I don't really identify with the baby boomers. I sort of feel like there's that whole generation of people who were born between, like, let's say, I'll be generous, like 1961 and 1968, who I think have had a really different experience than Generation X, but who are, my uncle is a baby boomer and he's in his 70s. So I don't really have a lot in common with people who are that much older than I am. You know what I mean? So it's it was a weird time, the mid-60s, to be born into, because I don't think that we fit into either. At least I personally don't feel. I feel closer to the Xers than I do to the baby boomers.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And I've always been a little uncomfortable and even suspicious in being lumped in with the baby boomers because, as you point out, that can include such a wide array of individuals, many of whom are completely different and much older than you and I are. And this whole generation thing, millennials, baby boomers, Generation Xers, or what have you, to some degree it's kind of arbitrary. So I really don't know where to put myself, although I will say that I would consider myself a modern man. And I don't mean that in necessarily a gendered way, but I use that term because in one of Woody Allen's early short stories, and I can't remember the title, it's one where it's in the first person where he is addressing a graduating class. And he starts off by talking about modern man, and he defines modern man as anyone born between Nietzsche's Edict, God is Dead, and the release of the Beatles' I Want to Hold Your Hand. So, I fall at the tail end of that, so I guess I'm modern.
All right,
but
I guess I'm thoroughly modern as well.
Yeah, thoroughly modern Gwen.
That's right.
That can be a movie. But anyway, getting back to Generation Gone. Now, are you familiar with some of Aleš's other works?
Yeah, I haven't read them in depth, but he's one of those creators who shows up a lot on Twitter. He has a very active Twitter feed, which I tend to follow for his political opinions more than really even for his art. But a lot of my exposure to comics creators actually is on Twitter first, because that's where I, keep up with all of the comics folks whom I follow probably more closely. But I had never really read any of his comics, so I came to this and sort of as a very fresh reader. So
okay, yeah, I mean, I know of some of his stuff like Change, Zero, Wolf, and The Surface. I know he's done some things for, I think it's Marvel, but
yeah, it's Marvel.
Yeah, and I haven't done any reading of his Marvel work, but it's primarily, I know him from Image Comics. And, this is an Image title. Mm-hmm. And I've come to really appreciate what he does. And so I did have high hopes for this series. And, I'm not disappointed. I mean, there are parts of it that, as I was reading this first trade, I wondered, okay, maybe that seems a little thin. But for the most part, in terms of story, but for the most part, I really did enjoy this. Now, I'm not familiar with the art of André Lima Araújo, and I guess I'm pronouncing that correctly, Araujo. I know he's done some work for Marvel as well, but I'm not familiar with it.
Well, my sense of it was that actually it felt more didactic than I was expecting. And I think that that's because this is a comic that really is aimed at a specific readership. And I wouldn't say that about all sci-fi comics, or even all sci-fi comics that deal with young people and coming of age as part of what they're doing. But I just really felt like some of this, I felt like I was being taught about philosophy, about sort of the industrial military complex. And so for me, it was just once I accepted that the audience, I think, was meant to skew younger, and that there was a feeling on the part of the comics creators that they really wanted to address that audience and maybe fill in some gaps in their knowledge about sort of the last 40 or 50 years of history. Then I found it to be a little bit less clunky and more enjoyable of a read. So that was I sort of shifted gears because I really felt like I guess we should sort of explain what's going on here. There are three young hackers who are really talented.
Right.
There's Baldwin, there's Elena, or Ellie as she's known, and there's Nick. And they all have very different backstories, but they're very close. And they have managed to break into the computer systems that were created by someone called Mr. Akira, who works as a government contractor for a super secret project that's going to benefit the military. But he has this side project where he's using he's using this code that he's created, working with the supposition that he could change our sort of DNA or code to turn us into super people. Mm-hmm. And these young kids hack into his database, and he's been following them and plans to use them as research subjects, all for the greater good, of course. And so there's this entire segment in which Mr. Akira is putting his project forward to these military folks whom he's working for, with the idea that maybe they'll allow him to actually focus more on this than on the original work that he was supposed to do. And he doesn't have a particularly receptive audience, but it gives the reader a sense for the sort of the backstory, so that when in fact these three young people are infected with the code, we understand what's happening, or we have that backstory. But a lot of Mr. Akira's interest is in philosophy and in sort of ethics. And so he goes through sort of, I think, trying to convince himself as much as anyone else about why this is a good project, why maybe changing someone's DNA code without their permission would be okay. And of course, what we find is that there's some pretty unintended results of this experimentation.
That's right. And, Akira, we know, or we learn a little bit about his backstory as well, which to some degree, I think, kind of explains why he does what he does, or why he's attempting to pursue what you just described, changing younger people's genetic codes. At the very beginning, you mentioned this meeting where we see Akira talking with a number of people from, I guess, the military. And apparently what they're working on is a project called STAR. It's S.T. A period, R period. And it's it's a subsection of another organization with an abbreviation called DARPA. Now, unless I'm forgetting, I don't know if we're ever told what STAR and DARPA refer to, what the full titles are.
Not yet. So.
Yeah. And we may learn that in subsequent issues. But at this meeting, Akio does tell the people he's addressing that, he's working on this Project Star. However, he is also working on a plan that he would ideally like to turn his attention and resources to, something that he calls Project Utopia. And I like the way that he describes it. And I think this gets at what you were talking about in terms of him changing people's code. He describes magic and science as not that different. Science is basically what we see and can prove. Magic is something that we haven't been able to witness yet, or if we have, we haven't been able to see it subsequently. And he says that code, and he describes code broadly speaking, right? Not just computer code. It's the flow of the traffic. It is computer code. It is our genetic DNA. It is the way that the rhythm of the ocean and the tides. And code is that which kind of bridges the gap between magic and science. And so I found that fascinating, and it does tell us quite a bit about Akio and his idealism, as wacky as it may sound. And I think that sets the stage, because if you don't pay attention to that opening section, when you get later into this first trade and you see Ellie, Nick, and Baldwin hacking into DARPA's system, and by the way, they're doing this not necessarily to cause havoc, but just to see what they can do. And because they've hacked into the system, Akio is aware of them. So unbeknownst to Ellie, Baldwin, and Nick, Akio is tracking them. He's even able to listen to them through their computers as they're practicing their hacking. And they also want to hack, and they also want to hack into Bank of America in order to get some money, because they feel that as millennials, they've been given the short end of the stick. So basically, they want a little more that's coming that they feel should be coming to them. But anyway, when Akio, in essence, I guess, infects them, or their DNA with this particular code, they start, I was about to say, vomiting some kind of red bile or a black bile. It looks somewhat like that. I mean, it's not necessarily described as bile, but this black matter seems to come from their mouth, their eyes, their various orifices. And that is the transformation. So this is basically following up on what Akio was telling this group of individuals in the first part of the book, and that is that it's the code that basically bridges the real to the magical.
Yeah, and if you're just sort of reading it, and it up until that point, there's nothing about it that suggests it's going to be as gruesome as it actually is. And It's like you go from like people sitting around their living room to just an unbelievable gush of bodily fluid. It's pretty interesting. It's well drawn. It certainly got my attention. So, but I just want to skip back quickly to that bank robbery, because it's interesting. All three characters have a different motivation for wanting to rob Bank of America, right? So Ellie is taking care of her mom who has cancer, and she wants to use the money to help her mom pay off her loans and pay for her cancer treatment. And Baldwin is interested in social justice, and so he would like to use the money in order to, try and affect that. And Nick is a very angry character, and we should probably mention that he's in a long-term relationship with Ellie, but it's a very dysfunctional relationship where he's taking out a lot of the anger that he feels over his brother Roy's death on Ellie, and really kind of punishing her. And unfortunately, she seems pretty willing to take that up to a certain point. And so, as a matter of fact, the very first scene in the comic is a pretty good illustration of the dysfunction in their relationship. And Nick is interested in buying drugs mainly so that he can just escape. And so each of the characters has a different kind of pain and a different kind of purpose. And I think that actually works quite well in the text. So then you have this moment where they all get these very different superpowers too, which I thought was fascinating.
We should mention that one of the characters, one of the hackers, Baldwin, you mentioned social justice. He's African-American, and so we see him at various parts of this first volume with an awareness of or doing things or in a setting that would suggest his concern with social justice. So, for instance, at one point he's in his apartment and we see he has a poster of Muhammad Ali. He also is set within a context of other things in this first volume that suggests that, he's in this because he does believe in social justice. So you're right. He and Ellie are the two more idealistic of the hackers, whereas Nick is someone, as you point out, we see from the very beginning, seems to be much more selfish, in it for himself, and not a very sympathetic character. And I think that's to say in the least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think that in some ways that's healthy because a lot of that rage that he feels is, as we find later, somewhat selfish rage, whereas, for instance, Baldwin's rage is based upon his subject position in the culture. I mean, There's a really interesting panel in that establishing scene for him in his apartment where he's reading on a newspaper site online that this headline that's African-American shot after offering to help lost driver.
Yeah.
Driver assumed man was going to rob him. What's really interesting about that is that I both understood what this was shorthand for, but I also at that very moment felt like, okay, the person who's drawing this comic and writing this comic, these are not people who were born in the U.S. and grew up here. And I say that because just the use of African American shot after offering to help lost driver would never be a headline that you would see in a U.S. paper. You'd much more likely see, black man shot, or and there wouldn't be any attempt to explain any of that so that the reader could just zoom right over it and assume that, oh, well, there's another black guy who's gotten himself in trouble, as opposed to, so I was kind of laughing. It was such a respectful title. Yeah. And, so I was like, that was just one of those little tiny meta moments where I stopped and I said, this is written by someone who's not from here, which is terrible. But I do really I really felt that the establishing scenes were effective. And I don't know if we want to go into too much more depth about what happens. We can leave that to folks to read it themselves. But I mean, even there are a lot of very well portrayed secondary characters. And one of the strengths of this comic is that even though, for instance, Ellie's mother is only in probably maybe 15 or 16 panels thus far, the way that she's portrayed, the things that she says, I would even say the way that she's drawn, there's a real sensitivity to the way that each character is drawn. And Ellie's mom looks like someone who has lost weight, who is battling cancer, but it's done in a way that's, I don't know, it's just very subtle, but you just really feel it. And that was probably for me, the greatest strength of the comic was actually the establishing stories and the depiction of not only the mom, but that military colonel guy,
the general,
who's working with Mr. Akio, and has a daughter who's got some issues and that sort of thing. He I don't particularly like him as a character, but I think he's well drawn. So I appreciated, certain aspects of this comic really strongly. Others, I sort of agree with you. There are points where I just sort of felt like, wow, we're now going to be taught something. But I think it really started to gather steam for me, and by the time I finished it, I actually wanted to read more. So
yeah. Now you mentioned the general. By the way, his name is General West. Right. You were saying earlier that with that headline, African American man shot, trying to help someone. You could tell this wasn't written and drawn by people originally from the U.S. I'm thinking of also the way that General West is represented. Now, we first see him at that aforementioned scene at the very beginning where Akio is addressing, I think it's about 6 people who are part of DARPA who are gathered around a table. Now, not all of them may be part of the, I guess you can call it the formal military, right? They could be others who are like civilians who are working for the military, but not in the military. But General West is in the military. I mean, he's a general, right?
Right.
One of the things that I noticed, and I have to say, it momentarily took me out of the story, which can be, slightly problematic. It didn't disrupt things or derail my reading experience. At no point do we see General West in anything other than a civilian suit. He doesn't wear a uniform at any place in this first trade, which I thought highly unusual, especially when you're trying to establish the fact that General West is the military liaison. I mean, he's the head honcho here. He's the guy who basically is calling the shots. He's in the military. He is literally commanding Akio as to what he is able and not able to do. But he doesn't wear a uniform, which I found a little strange.
It's interesting because later on in the comic, when he's talking to his daughter outside this secret facility in Alaska, all of the other people are dressed in regular outfits too. Like they have gray slacks and blue shirts. They don't have any kind of military insignia on them, but maybe that's the highly classified nature of what they're doing.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know. But yeah, I found that to be kind of interesting too, because, normally in a comic, when you have someone called General, they've got 7,000 ribbons and medals and epaulets and, the whole 9 yards. So
right. So, maybe Araújo was trying not to make General West visually stereotypical. Although the way that he's written, his behavior, I did find, for the most part, maybe not completely, a little stereotypical. In other words, he's the kind of character that we've encountered many, many times before in other narratives where the military-industrial complex is the big bad, right?
Right.
There always has to be some kind of officer, it could be a colonel, in this case it's a general, who is the main character who's not very attractive, and he basically is a stand-in for the military. There are some parts to General West that lead me to be a little sympathetic at times. It gets back to his daughter, and maybe in subsequent issues, or maybe in the next trade, Volume 2, we will see, if we want to stick with the trades instead of the single issues, we'll see more about his past, especially as it relates to his daughter, because, and again, I don't want to give anything away here, but the way that this first volume ends suggests that people, in addition to Ellie, Nick, and Baldwin, can be infected in ways, their DNA, that could benefit the individual and help them out of certain, let's say, physical or medical problems.
Right.
Again, I'm trying not to give anything away here, but there's the hint of that, and so maybe we'll learn more about the general and his daughter in issues to come. Right.
But overall, I found it to be a much more engaging read than I first thought. When I first started it, it felt a little slow, but I just whipped right through it after that. I really enjoyed it. And there are little touches here and there that we haven't really mentioned. I would say to readers, be sure to check out the backgrounds. There's certain establishing information that's available, like you were talking about the poster of Muhammad Ali, or in Ellie's home, there's a picture in one of the scenes where up on the wall, Ellie's done some little craft when she was a kid where there's her handprint and then her mom's handprint with a little heart that says mom. And so, that just kind of gives you a sense for their closeness. So there are little subtle details that can sometimes get lost because the story is so fast-paced that sometimes the backgrounds sort of seem inconsequential, but there are some interesting little clues there in the background as well.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that you pointed out, that especially as the story continues in this first volume, or as it progresses, it becomes increasingly violent. And if you're a reader listening to this who is kind of turned off by violence, just know that, this is a fascinating story, but there is violence involved. And we also have bodily fluids coming out, even when there is no violence being perpetrated. For instance, when their DNA is recoded and this black goo or whatever it is comes out of them. But there's also blood and, bloody violence. So there's that.
And I'll just mention really quickly that when I was reading other reviews of this comic, some people pointed to its relationship to Akira, the Japanese manga series that was illustrated by Katsuhiro Otomo.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you said that you'd read it, Derek, and I've looked through it before. And it's sort of that same thing with governmental agencies using teenagers and the ethical implications of that. So if you've liked those sorts of comics where you're looking at kids versus, the authorities or whatever, that certainly is happening here too. But it doesn't have the sort of humor and buoyancy of, say, the Scooby-Doo type genre, right? Of, hey, you kids, get off my lawn. This is a much more sci-fi, sort of definite hardcore violence in the middle of the comic for sure, and among the characters. So it's a more serious text, but it's also still working within that tradition of, kids looking at the authority around them, questioning it, and in some ways being used by it and trying to fight back against that.
Exactly. Yeah, the link between Generation Gone, or at least what we have of Generation Gone in this first trade, and Akira by Otomo is young people being changed through some catastrophic means, and then it results in kind of supernatural powers of some sort, right? And that's what we have here with Ellie, Nick, and Baldwin in particular. Now, some of the differences between Generation Gone and Akira is that, Akira is set in a post-apocalyptic world, whereas Generation Gone isn't. It's a narrative space that we can all relate to in one form or another, which is not really the case with Akira. In fact, I wanted to ask you about the temporal setting of Generation Gone. Having read this first trade, when do you think this takes place?
Well, it actually, I think, says 2020. So it was like 4 years in the future. Well, not 4 years, sorry. I'm still thinking back to the election. It's just a few years in the future, right?
Yeah. Okay. So it says that we're in the year 2020 in the comic?
I think it was on the back cover, I think.
Oh.
I can't totally remember, but I think it was the back cover that says it's 2020. And
I see. Yes, you're right. See. Yeah, on the back cover of the trade.
Yeah, America 2020, 3 young hackers with nothing to lose, a secretive scientist with a plan. Okay, so you get the idea.
Yeah, in fact, the reason I asked that is because I went to the Image Comics website and looked at Generation Gone because I wanted to see when the official release date was, which, again, was January 3rd, last week. And they describe this, I guess it is the same copy that you find on the back cover. America 2020, 3 young hackers with nothing to lose, a secret scientist with a plan, so on and so forth. And when I read that, again, and I guess I just ignored the back cover of this first trade, I thought, I don't remember there being any indication in the story proper that this is taking place in 2020. And I don't think there is. So again, if you didn't go to the Image Comics website or read the back cover, you wouldn't know that this is set just a few years in the future, not that many, which I found a little curious. I mean, why mention it on the back cover and in copy, in other words, and not mention the year 2020 at any point in the story?
I think one of the reasons they picked 2020 is that that's the year that we will have a presidential election. Mm-hmm. And, we are living through the Trump era. You get a lot of critique.
God, don't remind me.
Sorry. You get a lot of critique in this comic of many of the positions which have been put forward by our current administration. And maybe the comics creators just didn't want to go there. They didn't want to create a reality in which they had to deal with all of these real life political figures. Mm-hmm. And I understand that because, as I've done my own research with Barack Obama in comics, no matter what you want to say, when Barack Obama shows up in a comic book, it takes all of the focus off of the story and onto Obama. And it really does. And I think that probably these comics creators were trying to create a world that young people could absolutely relate to without necessarily pinning it specifically to politicians. Mm-hmm. And I think 2020 is an interesting year because it would be possible that by that point, Donald Trump would no longer be president and it could be someone else. But you get the sense that maybe it doesn't matter who's president. The feeling you get in this book is that the military is running everything anyway. And they don't have to answer, at least right now, to any of the protesters who are in the streets protesting against policies. So it almost turns our problem into a faceless one, which, if you really want to think about it, makes some sense. Trump is just the showy facade of a lot of really bad policy. Sorry to put my view forward so directly, but he's just the show. He's the distraction behind what is a real erosion in civil rights and in constitutional rights, frankly. And so I think that this text, I think it was a happy decision by these creators to avoid that, because otherwise then I think readers would just focus on that. Because I think no matter what one's political affiliation happens to be, if a young person is between the ages of 18 and 30, they're probably struggling right now in one way or another. And I think that they would find a lot to identify with in this comic.
Right. Now, you mentioned young people demonstrating and protesting. I mean, there is a scene in this first trade of Generation Gone where a group of people, young and maybe not so young, are really protesting. In other words, it's the disenfranchised, right? It's not the privileged who are doing this. And I think that does help drive the point home of the generational differences, especially as it relates to class.
Right.
And social status. Yeah. That makes sense, what you just said, in terms of setting this temporally in the year 2020. Although I do have to say, I'd rather this had been set in the year 2525. Because, in the year 2525, if man is still alive, if woman can survive, they may find Zagger and Evans.
Yeah, I know.
So there you go. My little pop cultural from the 60s reference for the day.
Yep.
Yes.
Well done, sir.
Okay, let's move on to the next title that you and I are going to be discussing this week. And this is an interesting one in a number of ways. It is Assassinistas. This is written by Tini Howard with art by one of my favorites, Gilbert Hernandez. It comes out through IDW's Black Crown imprint, and this is the imprint that Shelly Bond is overseeing. I guess a creator-owned a series of comics. And, we looked at the comics alternative at a previous, and I think the very first Black Crown release. Paul and I discussed Kid Lobotomy, and we looked at the first two issues, and we liked it well enough, but we had some issues with it, and I think some of those issues I somewhat carry over to this first issue of Assassinistas, and I'll get to that in a moment. But this is interesting. Basically, here you have a story about three assassins, or former assassins, all female: Octavia Red October Price, Charlotte Scarlet Costa, and Rosalyn Blood Diamond. And in this first issue, which actually came out in December, so I guess not quite a month ago, we basically go back and forth in time. They're basically two I guess, two times. There's the then and there's the now, and that's basically how they distinguish the two. And we're given a few bits of information from the then, and this is when Octavia, Scarlet, and Rosalyn were assassins. But most of the story takes place in the now, the recent, when Octavia, Scarlet, and Rosalyn are no longer, as far as we know, assassins, but they have tried to integrate into life in, I guess, a more normalized way. So, for instance, Scarlet, who's nicknamed Scarlet, has married someone, has a kid, and is pregnant with another child. Octavia, Red October, is no longer an assassin, but she is, I think she works with kidnapping insurance. Yeah. And so, it's a legitimate business. And we don't really know much about what's going on with Rosalyn Blood Diamond, although that becomes one of the mysteries of this first issue. And so in the now, I mean, we're given little glimpses into the then, right?
Right.
The threes past. But in the now, basically, what happens is that Scarlet has Octavia over. She's talking with her about kidnapping insurance. She's overly protective of her young son. She has another one on the way. And Octavia is telling Scarlet, well, basically, most of my clients are rich people who are just paranoid. They don't need it, but hey, they pay me, so I don't argue with them. Octavia is also having certain financial issues, which kind of seeps into her relationship with her son, Dominique, who's a junior in college, or at least who wants to be a junior in college. But because his mother is unable to pay the tuition, Dominique learns, unfortunately, he's going to have to take a semester off. Dominique has a lover, another man by the name of Taylor, that he brings home to Octavia because Octavia asks her son Dominique to come home to help her with a job. And Dominique isn't really enamored of the fact that his mother used to be an assassin. And he hopes that she hasn't kind of resorted back to her old assassin ways. And so he asks his lover, Taylor, his boyfriend, Taylor, to come back with him. And Taylor's all excited. He said, hey, not only do I not want to leave you, but I'm fascinated by your mother who used to be an assassin. This is going to be cool. And so that's basically what's going on here. Charlotte's son is kidnapped. We think, and this is not a spoiler, we think that it may be Rosalyn who did the kidnapping, but we're not entirely sure. And so Scarlet calls up Octavia and says, you got to help me. And this is where Octavia seems to be going back to her own assassin ways, where she asks her son to come home. And that's basically the setup of this first issue.
Yeah, Derek, it's really interesting because the feeling of this comic for me is actually very much that of the 1980s. The color choices, the settings. For instance, Octavia meets her boyfriend, whom she has Dominic with, in a skating rink, and I guess that really is meant to be in the 80s, right? Because Dominic would be in college now, so if it were the late 80s, that would make sense, right? Mm-hmm. My math isn't the best, but or early 90s. And so there's these, I really actually enjoyed the flashbacks. Mainly, though, I just enjoy the art of Gilbert, Hernandez. He just has this way with this really clear line style. Well, there's a lot of shading too, but predominantly clear line style of just evoking a lot of emotion. And I think so much of it is the close-up on characters' faces and his attention to the way he draws faces, including, I love this, the little kid Kyler, who's Charlotte's son. Mm-hmm. He's just such a little screaming brat. He wants a knife, so you get the sense that he's following his mom's predilection for violence. And he's such a little brat. And I just love the way that child is drawn, just the entire time that Charlotte's trying to talk seriously with Octavia about kidnapping insurance. If you just look at Kyler and his expressions and stuff, you get the sense that maybe Charlotte hired someone to kidnap her own kid. I'm only kidding, really, but there's some sort of aspect of that going on.
Yeah, and I'm right there with you when it comes to the art of Gilbert Hernandez, and it's not often that we see him doing art in a narrative that someone else has written. I mean, he's done it before. He's illustrated comics that his brother Mario has written, or at least helped write. And then he did several years ago a mini-series, later collected as, I guess, a trade, with Peter Bagge called Yeah. And, he did the art on that when Peter Bagge was doing the writing. So this is a little different. So if you like Gilbert Hernandez's art, then you'll definitely like Assassinistas #1. But you don't get Gilbert Hernandez writing. Actually, the writer is Tini Howard. And I wanted to ask you, Gwen, are you familiar with anything else that Tini Howard has done?
Well, it's interesting because I looked her up because I was really fascinated by the name. And she's written Magdalena, which I have looked at briefly. She's done work for the Power Rangers Pink. And she also writes essays for venues like Pace Magazine and Teen Vogue. And in January of 2016, she wrote an essay that I remember reading at the time that was called If the Cape Fits, Trusting Women to Write Supermen. And it's this really great essay on the fact that very often men are applauded for their doing a great job of writing women, but it's also assumed that they're completely capable of doing that. Whereas, frankly, women are not always given the opportunity to write from a male focalization, right? And so I knew her more for her prose than for her comics writing. And so it was really exciting to look her up and go, oh, I remember reading that. I remember, filing that away somewhere. So that's all that I know about her. Are you familiar with her or her work?
No, I'm not. This is the first thing that I have read of hers, but I did look her up on the internet, in particular Comic Vine, to see what else she's done. She has done some writing for Rick and Morty and Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, Pink, and then she, I think, wrote the 4-issue series, I think it's 4 issues, from Black Mask, The Skeptics. Now, none of those, and you mentioned Magdalena, none of those have I read, so I didn't know what to expect, but I was curious as to, who would team up with Gilbert Hernandez for this. And, I have to say, I did enjoy this first issue. If I didn't know that Gilbert wasn't the writer, looking at the art, I'd say, okay, this is a Gilbert Hernandez title, because not only is the art obviously Gilbert's, but the story strikes me as something that Gilbert would do, right? You have these 3 women who used to be assassins. Now they're supposedly no longer assassins, but their assassin past kind of catches up with them in certain ways. There's something a little unusual about that I think we can find in a lot of Gilbert Hernandez comics. So I don't know if this is something that Tini Howard kind of tailored to Gilbert or not. Now, she does say at the very back of this issue that this is a story she's had in mind for quite a while. And so I guess this is something that she just thought, hey, this probably fits the kind of art that Gilbert Hernandez does. And it's very similar to his work.
Well, actually, it wasn't her idea. It was her editor's idea. And she was shocked when they put Gilbert's name. She, in fact, in the interview for AV News, she said...
Oh, really?
Yeah. Basically, Shelly Bond suggested it and said, quote, when she casually threw out Gilbert's name, I froze because it didn't seem possible. But the issue was that now the tone of the book was perfect to me. I could instantly see everyone in Gilbert's style, and the book had this sense of cool that I could just not bring to it. I assume she means on her own. But now I had this problem that I had nailed the book down as a Gilbert Hernandez book, and if we weren't able to get Gilbert, I was going to be a real stickler for wanting to find someone that could nail that tone. So, obviously at first it wasn't her idea, but then once it was suggested to her, I think it helped her to even think about the comic. And Gilbert said he's not used to writing like this or, to doing this sort of thing. And he said...
You mean working with another writer?
Working with another writer other than his brother, right? Or at least in tandem.
Well, he's done this before though with, the aforementioned Peter Bagg, and also let's not forget Darwin Cook's Twilight's Children from a few years ago.
He said in the same interview, he was talking about how he said, quote, "I'm always looking to improvise anytime I draw a comic, but this time I strive to have self-discipline." He said, "To get what the writer wants on the page as accurately as I can muster." And he said what excites him the most about Assassinistas is just what excited me. It's the roller disco era, because I was just laughing. Everything just has this incredible feel. And by the way, Rob Davis does the color, and it works to me. So I really actually enjoyed this more than I thought I would, given the subject matter, and I'm going to keep reading it just because I'm really curious as to what the heck's going on with Rosalyn Blood Diamond,
Yeah. And, now, is this the interview you're referring to on CBR?
I think so. It was from July 21st, 2017.
This is August 3rd.
Oh, no, this is AV News.
Okay, AV News. Okay, Sorry. I'll have to check that one out.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting. You're saying that working with Gilbert was not Tini Howard's idea, or are you saying that this story of Assassinistas wasn't her idea?
Oh, it was her idea, and she had come up with it, and then Shelly Bond said, well, hey, let's have Gilbert Hernandez do the art.
Yeah, because in her brief write-up in the letter section at the very end of this, she says, "I can't believe we're here. Assassinistas is an idea I've had for years, ever since I wrote a short story called Heartbeats about a young man coming out to his assassin mother." So yeah, apparently this is an idea she's had for quite a while, and Shelly Bond hooked her and Gilbert Hernandez up. It's interesting. I do like this. I want to continue with this series. Not only because I love the work of Gilbert Hernandez and I feel like I need to read everything he does, but also I like the story.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Now, I do want to say a couple things about this issue. You remember at the top of our discussion of Assassinistas, I mentioned that last year Paul and I discussed Kid Eternity, and I and even Paul had some issues with that first issue. I don't want to talk about the issues of the story of Kid Eternity because I liked it. I just felt that it needed a little more room to breathe. But the thing that kind of bugged me a little bit about that first and even second issue of Kid Eternity, I'm sorry, I said Kid Eternity. It's Kid Lobotomy. Kid Eternity is a completely different comic. Kid Lobotomy is that at the back of the issue, there's a brief write-up by Shelly Bond. And both Paul and I thought that in that brief commentary, she was trying to be maybe a little too hip in what she was trying to do. And, I have to say that her brief write-up in the back of Assassinistas #1 is the same way. Mm-hmm. And maybe this is the way she writes. Maybe this is who she is. She's talking about at one point a musical group called Cud, spilled trade secret, Cud or nothing. Okay, this is fine. I don't know if I necessarily need or even appreciate these little write-ups. I know that Black Crown is her imprint with IDW, her creator-owned imprint for IDW, mm-hmm. and she's trying to brand it. She's trying to stake out, I guess, an identity for this imprint. So I can understand what she's doing here. To me, the brief write-ups that I guess this is called the definite article, I don't know. I can do without.
I hear you. And I always find it really difficult when you look at the first, issue of a comic. I try to withhold some judgment because, normally for me, it takes a while for me to warm up to a story. There are very few comics that I read where from the very first panel or, even the first issue, I'm deeply drawn in. And so, but I can see what you're saying for sure.
Yeah. And, and it's not the story proper, right? It's not the work of Howard and Hernandez that I'm commenting on here. I'm being critical of. It's the paratextual information that surrounds this story. So, primarily Shelly Bond with a brief write-up telling us about her love and discovery of this group called CUD. Do I need to know that? Does it have anything to do with the story that I just read by Howard and Hernandez? No. Again, I understand what Shelly Bond is attempting to do here, right? She's attempting to give Black Crown a particular stamp, an identity, as an imprint from IDW. I could do without it. But again, maybe I'm being a little too critical. Maybe our listeners who are really getting into Black Crown comics find this quite fascinating and are big Shelly Bond fans and want to follow her, not only the kind of creators that she has for this imprint, but also her musical tastes, like CUD. So, Gwen, do you want to move on to the final comic that we're discussing this week?
Sure.
Okay, this is Love and Rockets Volume 4, Number 4. And for those of you who may not be aware, well, first off, shame on you if you're not aware of this. But this is the fourth incarnation of Love and Rockets. Love and Rockets, which began in 1981 and then in 82, depending on how you define the beginning of Love and Rockets, started off as a magazine-sized comic book from Fantagraphics. I mean, all the Love and Rockets are from Fantagraphics. And that ran for 50 issues. Then the Hernandez brothers, primarily Jaime and Gilbert, there's also Mario, but primarily Gilbert and Jaime, took a break from Love and Rockets, did their own thing with comic book titles from Gilbert and then comic book titles from Jaime, and then eventually went back to a second volume of Love and Rockets, which began in, 2001, I think it was. Maybe I'm off here. And it was comic book size, right? So it wasn't magazine sized anymore. That ran for a few years. And then they turned Love and Rockets into, I guess, a graphic novel, if you want to call it that. It was an annual. And so instead of Love and Rockets coming out, let's say 4 times a year, it would come out only once a year. They did that for several years. Then they discontinued the annual Love and Rockets to restart the magazine-sized quarterly, the 4th issue of which we're discussing right now. And so it's interesting to look at the history and the evolution of Love and Rockets. I know that when Andy Kunka and I interviewed Gilbert Hernandez a couple of years ago, I think it was to us that was one of the very first times that he mentioned that they may be ending the annual graphic novel format and would go back to a quarterly. And so that was breaking news at the time. And I'm proud to say that we got it on the Comics Alternative straight from Gilbert Hernandez's mouth. So now we're, I guess, about a little more than a year now into the magazine-sized 4th volume of Love and Rockets. And this issue, number 4, came out from Fantagraphics in November of last year. And in fact, the 5th issue should be coming out in another month or 2. So they're keeping up with everything, and I really do appreciate that. Now, in terms of Love and Rockets, maybe this is a way we can begin, Gwen. I know you're familiar with Love and Rockets. Do you keep up with Love and Rockets?
Well, it depends. I'm much more interested in Jaime's narratives than in Gilbert's. And I guess it's just because I used to live in California and I really love the character of Maggie. And so when I do dip into Love and Rockets, it's almost always the Maggie-centered stories that I've read. I think that I really want to say that Love and Rockets, I think, is a way of life. I think if you're really keeping up with it, you know so much more than I do. I know, Derek, you are a walking, talking encyclopedia of the brothers Hernandez. I'm not, and you had asked me earlier to talk a little bit about my response to reading this particular issue when I hadn't been reading a lot of Love and Rockets recently. And it was fine. I mean, I had to remind myself of certain characters and go back and look certain things up, especially for the stories that take place in Palomar, right? Because I'm not as familiar with those storylines, but it really doesn't matter, because one of the things that I will say about both Gilbert and Jaime is that they just create such a strong atmosphere in their drawings that you can dip into the story, at least I can dip into the story and enjoy it and sort of just feel like I could pick up what cues I need in order to proceed. So for me, it was a really enjoyable read. But I'll admit that the scenes that took place in LA or San Fernando Valley or wherever made more sense to me than the stuff that was going on in Palomar. But that's my level of reading Love and Rockets. So
and
now you are the expert. So
well, I don't know about expert, but I mean, I've tried to read everything that the brothers have done, Love and Rockets and otherwise. And the reason I asked you before we turned on the mics how you kept up or how much of Love and Rockets do you read is because I've always been well, not always. It's not like I was born this way, but in recent years, let's say, I have been fascinated with the question of how someone can get into Love and Rockets. It just strikes me, and I've heard people say this before, that they're not really into Gilbert and Jaime's work because they're intimidated by it. In other words, so much has been done. After all, this began in 1981, Love and Rockets. And so, you have now over 30 years of story from both brothers, from Jaime and his story world, primarily with the Locas stories, and then Gilbert's Palomar and even post-Palomar stuff, particularly with Fritz, that, there's just a lot of story material to deal with. And so at what point may you be able to enter this story world kind of late in the game, if at all? So for instance, I was curious, you picking up this fourth issue of Love and Rockets Volume 4, did you feel lost with some of these various segments that were going on, or did you feel that there's enough there that Gilbert and Jaime revealed in each of their stories that you didn't feel lost?
Well, one thing I'll say is whenever someone decides to really invest in a particular universe, whether it's a movie franchise like Star Wars or whether it's a comic series like Love and Rockets, I don't think that if a series has been around for 3 or 4 or 5 decades, I don't think that I don't approach those things linearly anyway. I think that you enter it where you are. Like, for instance, I will admit that I have not watched what are now the first 3 movies in the Star Wars saga. I plan to, but it will never be a linear process for me because I grew up with what are now 4, 5, and 6, right?
Mm-hmm,
so
right.
I think that it just depends on, I guess, a person's orientation or their comfort level with jumping into something and then going back when they need reference. But I'm also going to argue for the power of both of these comics creators' work, that it is very strong. And like I said, even though it had been years since I'd read anything about Luba or Max or some of those other characters from Gilbert's universe, right, I could sort of remember, and then I could look something up and then go back in and continue to enjoy it. Because for me, what I've always loved about their work is their ability to create atmosphere of a particular time and place. That's why, like in Assassinistas, right, that I was saying what I really loved about it was evoking that kind of disco era feeling, or late disco, more like 80s disco era, and that this really does an amazing job of sort of depicting a certain time period as well, and it does it really well. So I often read for atmosphere anyway, or for character interaction, so it wasn't that difficult of a transition for me, but it might be for someone who was unfamiliar entirely with with it, and this would be the first thing they would pick up, I think it would be really confusing.
Yeah. Along with that, there have been a couple of times recently in the past year that I have spoken with Gilbert Hernandez or communicated with him. One in an interview that I did with him last year that's going to be part of an interview collection of the Hernandez brothers that I hope will be coming out later this year from University Press in Mississippi. And then at Heroes Con, when Andy Kunka and I moderated a panel that Gilbert and Jaime were on. And I asked him both times, in so many words, if he thought that people could get, like people who are just coming to Love and Rockets now, could get into his story world. And, in many ways, he kind of dismissed that. He said, no, I don't think people could. And, they can try if they want, but I'm not necessarily writing for people who are, wanting a lot of backstory and exposition in order to introduce them to the world of, let's say, Palomar for him and Fritz. He doesn't feel the responsibility of catching readers up in his story world, which I don't blame him. And I've always, again, that along with what I've heard from other people, that they're a little intimidated by what both Jaime and Gilbert have done. Like, where do I come in? It's kind of like, in many ways, I often make comparisons between the Hernandez brothers, in particular, Gilbert, and the world of William Faulkner, right? How easily can you get into the world of Yoknapatawpha County? I think fairly easily. So, whether you start with Go Down Moses or Absalom or The Sound of the Fury, I think each of them stands on its own. But nonetheless, Faulkner created a narrative world, a fictional narrative world, Yoknapatawpha County, and throughout his career populated it with events, characters, and what have you, a history. Gilbert does the same in terms of his Palomar and even post-Palomar stories. But I think that at times getting into the stories of, let's say, Gilbert, but also with Jaime, may be a little challenging, because if you don't know what happened before, you may or may not understand what's going on now. And I want to use that comment to kind of get into issue number 4, which we're discussing for this week, of Love and Rockets Volume 4. One of the things I noticed in this issue is the first time in a long time we don't have any Fritz stories. Okay, now what I mean by that is, the character Fritz does show up in the first Gilbert installment, which is called Since I Don't Have You. But that's primarily a Peepo story, and Peepo and Fritz are married, but apparently in the process of getting a divorce. We briefly see the character Fritz, who is a half-sister of Luba, for maybe 2 or 3 panels, something like that. But then after that, we don't see her. She's referenced 1 or 2 times, but we don't see her. In previous issues of Love and Rockets, both in this 4th volume and even in the annual that came out several years ago, there were primarily Gilbert's contributions were stories centered around Fritz and the world that she created, especially as it relates to Fritz wannabes. And in fact, Fritz, for those who may not know, is she had been a psychotherapist. She eventually became a porn star, and she had a very wide and devoted following. So much so that there were many young, let's say well-endowed women who wanted to look like Fritz, who tried to emulate Fritz. And so these were the Fritz wannabes. And Andy Kunka and I have mentioned a couple of times on the Comics Alternative when we've looked at Love and Rockets issues that after a while it becomes really damn confusing trying to figure out who these Fritz wannabes are, because many of them look somewhat similar, not only to Fritz, but to each other. So keeping up with who is who and what kind of Fritz imitator she may be was quite a challenge. We don't have this anywhere in issue number 4 of Love and Rockets. And so to me, this issue, the most recent one, is most notable because we don't have an emphasis on Fritz wannabes.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now, the way that this is broken down, we have, 6 segments of this first issue The first and fifth are stories by Gilbert. I already mentioned the first one, Since I Don't Have You, which is the longer of the two Gilbert installments in this issue. And this is primarily a story about Peepo. Peepo is going back, or at least says she's going to go back to Palomar in order to attend the funeral of someone that she grew up with, Soledad. And then we get a flashback about a young Peepo when she was around 14 years old, her relationship with Soledad, and then others. And we also see a younger adult, Luba, not the Luba that we recognize now, who is quite old. And this is the longer of the two Gilbert stories. There is a brief, 2 or 3 page Killer story, and Killer is Luba's granddaughter, who was a movie star, but she wants to be a singing star. And then the gist of this short Killer narrative is that she's talking with her friend whose name escapes me, I can't remember, about how she doesn't want to be objectified. And Chino, yeah, that's her friend. And we've seen Chino before. She doesn't want to be objectified. She wants to sing, but she knows that she's not the best singer. And that's basically the gist of this 2-pager about Killer. And then the rest of the issue is made up of Jaime segments. We have, I guess the third story is a continuation of this Princess Animus and Ilsa storyline. And with the last issue, I think it was, the Princess Animus storyline and the Ilsa storyline came together. I think that Paul and I commented on that. It was either issue number 3 or 2. I can't remember. But then the other 3 contributions from Jaime are Loca stories. The first one, which follows Gilbert's Peepo story, is a younger Maggie and Hopi when they're at Dell's place, and we had seen Dell previously. And it's about what's going on there. It takes place, I guess, in the late 70s, and we have this kind of disco-looking, you were mentioning disco in terms of Assassinistas, we get a disco-looking drug dealer who is trying to get Maggie and several of the others from Huerta to run drugs for him. And then the very last story from Jaime is also a Loca story, and we have Maggie and Hopi as young, but not teenage young, right? They're a little older. But we also have, again, this drug dealer who has now shed his disco-looking garb and who's trying to look punk and trying to get Maggie to run drugs for him. And then the other Loca story, which is actually my favorite. It's titled 12th Street and Vine. And the reason it's my favorite is that I'm a big fan of Ray. And Ray is the sometimes lover, I guess now lover, of Hopi. And this is basically a follow-up to what went on in The Love Bunglers. Did you read Jaime's The Love Bunglers, both either in Love and Rockets or as a book?
No.
Yeah, Ray, who has been infatuated with Maggie most of his life, has an accident. He's beat over the head by Maggie's brother, Calvin, and Calvin is a little mentally off, and so that's why Calvin picks up a brick and beats Ray. Ray is not sure who attacked him. Also, he has brain damage. And at the end of Love Bunglers, that storyline, Maggie starts to care for Ray, and in many ways that kind of reignite the relationship. It may not be the kind of sexual relationship that they once had, but it's nonetheless one that is deep and tender. And so here we have kind of a continuation of what went on in Love Bunglers. I like this. Again, it's short. It's just, I think, 2 pages long, but to me, it's the most powerful thing in this issue of Love and Rockets.
And it has a lot of exposition, so even if you weren't fully aware of the backstory, there's enough here that you do kind of get what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, especially in this issue, and you correct me if I'm wrong, because you're the one who hasn't been keeping up with Love and Rockets of the two of us, Jaime stories are a little easier to digest coming in the middle of, because I think he does provide to some degree enough exposition where you're not completely lost. I think with Gilbert, it may be a little more necessary to know what happened in previous issues of Love and Rockets.
Is that the case? True. Yeah, okay. I think that's absolutely true.
But again, this is another great issue of Love and Rockets. I know that every time a Love and Rockets issue comes out, we discuss it on the Comics Alternative. I know that every time an issue comes out, I sing the praises of the Hernandez brothers. I know that I'm biased. I know that our listeners are probably tired of me going on and on about Gilbert and Jaime. But I love this comic. When people ask me, when they find out that I read comics and they go, "Oh, what's your favorite comic?" And of course, they're expecting me to say something like, Batman or Captain America or something like that. I say, Love and Rockets.
Yeah.
And then people usually go, if they're not into comics, what's that? And then I try to use the occasion to introduce them to this wonderful title. So, Gwen, I'm particularly interested in what you've been saying about issue number 4 of Love and Rockets Volume 4, because I do think that there are those individuals out there who are afraid to pick up an issue of Love and Rockets because they're not familiar with the previous storylines. But you're saying that you got a lot out of this issue.
I just embrace the 21st century, Derek. I don't need linear certainty to enjoy something. I really don't. And I just want to underscore that what I appreciate the most about the brothers Hernandez is their ability to create these, within 1 or 2 panels, this incredible feeling of place, wherever that place is. And because that resonates with me, as an example, one of the reasons I love Truman Capote is that he has this concomitant way of creating a sense of place within 4 or 5 sentences. And you're just suddenly sucked into this other world. And so, I think we all have our reasons for appreciating different comics. I completely respect your devotion to this comic. And of course, because you know it so well, you have every right to say that it's your favorite comic. You know what you're talking about. But I really often like comics for the atmosphere that they create. And I really loved Volume 4. In fact, of the comics that we read, I found it to be really the most satisfying read. And
I think maybe, of the 3 titles?
Absolutely. Because there's just a certain sophistication and confidence that's present in this particular comic. These are guys who don't have to prove anything to anyone. They've been doing this for a really long time. And I'm sorry, but there's an economy to their comic storytelling that shows. The other 2 comics that we read, a lot of the narrative was driven by words, by exposition. And of course, to be fair, they're both, we were looking at first issues with the trade. We're looking at the first 5, but let's face it, they're both establishing comics. Whereas, maybe there's an advantage to dipping into a comic that's been going on a long time. And I don't have to sit through all that establishing stuff. I can just enjoy the moments that are put forward here. And remember, I'm familiar enough with it that I'm not completely out in left field, but I really enjoyed, I always enjoy reading Love and Rockets. I probably should make more time for it, but you already know my reading list is yay high, so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I think it's great what you're saying here, that you can appreciate what both Gilbert and Jaime are doing just by picking up an issue without, let's say, knowledge or memory of what happened in previous issues. And so it's great that Love and Rockets can be enjoyed that way. It can also be enjoyed by those who are really enmeshed in the world of both Jaime and Gilbert. Case in point, that aforementioned story of Ray and Maggie, 12th Street and Vine, that I gushed over. Mm-hmm. In the very last panel, and this is on page 28 of this issue, Ray is basically, this is a comic, a 2-page comic, where Ray is basically a voiceover. And we get that a lot in Ray comics, where he basically speaks, so to speak, off panel. telling us what's going on with him or what his thoughts are. And this very last panel, he says, things are finally leveled off. Haven't had a blackout in almost a year. Got a new job. Maggie's at a punk reunion with all her friends, which is an ongoing storyline. We didn't get in this issue. Oh, yeah. And it's 3 a.m. and Sonny won't leave. And Ray is looking at us, the reader, in that panel. And then in the background is his friend Sonny. And Sonny's watching TV. On the TV screen is Princess Animus, which is another storyline that Jaime has been playing out in these recent issues, both annual and magazine form of Love and Rockets. So, again, if you knew about the Princess Animus storyline, then you recognize that. But if you didn't know about this other storyline from Jaime, really, you're not losing out on anything.
Yeah, and, I think that there's various ways of entering a narrative. As an example, about 3 or 4 years ago, a really good friend of mine, I was over at her house and we were watching an episode of Frasier, and I hadn't watched Frasier in years. When it was on as a series, I only watched it intermittently. But my friend had watched the series multiple times on Netflix, and we were watching some episode, and it was funny, and I enjoyed it. But she pointed out to me that there were things that I was missing out of the significance of it because I hadn't seen the whole series. And now I have, in fact, seen the whole series. I binged on that a couple years ago, and I get what she means, but I still think that there's some value in, either way of looking at the text. But I wouldn't say that with every artifact, right? In other words, again, I really want to point out that the comics creators we're talking about here are really skilled and are exceptional at creating mood and the moment. If that hadn't been the case, then maybe I wouldn't have enjoyed it as much, but I did, so there.
Gwen, we've had a great time talking about 3 recent titles. We started off with Generation Gone, Volume 1, the trade paperback, written by Alice Cott with art by André, Lima, Araújo. Then we looked at the very first issue of Tini Howard and Gilbert Hernandez's Assassinistas. And then we wrapped up by looking at issue number 4 of Love and Rockets, Volume 4, by the Hernandez brothers, of course. So, yeah, a lot of good reading, something to gladly occupy ourselves with in this cold weather. And we strongly recommend that our listeners check out these titles. Worth picking up. And we know of a place to get titles like this at a great discount. Guess where that is?
I bet it's Discount Comic Book Service.
You are right, my friend. Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and there you're going to find great specials every single month. And as Gwen pointed out at the top of the show, some of these titles and even future issues of these titles are going to be right now at great discounts at dcbservice.com, so definitely check them out. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
You can also contact us by email at 2guys, the number 2guys, at comicsalternative.com. Or you can get in touch with us individually. I'm Gwen at comicsalternative.com. Derek, how can people reach you?
Via Derek at comicsalternative.com, curiously enough. We're all over social media, so you can check us out that way. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, and we have a Slack channel. Don't forget that. We have a number of people who contribute and speak up on Slack, so we would like for you to as well. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcast. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com. So a lot of ways for people to get in touch with us.
Yep, Derek. It's a good place to go for all of your comics listening needs, comicsalternative.com. I often go there to look at previous podcasts that you guys have done when I'm teaching a comic or reading a comic for the first time. So it's a good place to go.
That's cool. I appreciate that. And we hope that our listeners will get in touch with us and let us know what they thought about not only this episode, but also past episodes of the Comics Alternative. We do like to hear from you.
Absolutely. So till next time.
I'm Derek.
I'm Gwen.
Take care.
See ya.
Hey, what happened?